this computer. Okay. All right, we're recording now. So like I was just saying, we've been talking about some pretty big topics about home malting and really complex mash regimes and things like that. And a couple people mentioned on the Facebook page that they'd never actually tried brewing gluten-free before or at all. And a big part of the mission of the club is to grow new brewers, just people who haven't brewed before and want to learn how to brew, and they want to learn how specifically gluten-free. So I thought about the best recipe that I could roll out, which is, internet connection is unstable. I hope I'm not breaking up on you guys. I thought about what it is that we could do to make a real simple extract-only beer. And then it's one that you can measure up against the commercial version. Commercial clones are a good way to check your process and see how you're doing. And I thought about a beer that I did early on, which is a clone of Ghostfish's Grapefruit IPA, which is a great beer. It's a 2-time GABF winner. It uses only sorghum and brown rice syrup. Also, I added some maltodextrin. I think that's also on the label, that they use maltodextrin for some residual sugar, and then just some hops and some grapefruit zest. Some of the key terms that new brewers might not know, it's not pronounced wort, it's wort or wort, depending on how German you want to go with it. And that's just your unfermented beer. You're mixing your fermentables with your water and boiling it with hops, and that's really just the process. That's the brewing process. When I talk about brewing, I'm talking about the things we're doing on brew day. And then after that, we're going to hand it over to the yeast and start fermenting it. There's an age-old saying that brewers make wort and yeast makes beer. So the yeast, when we add it, that's just called pitching, and you talk about the size of your pitch. It just sounds an awful lot cooler. So pitching is something we do with our yeast. The two big main things in all of this are your cleaning and your sanitizing. And you can think about this like you do with washing your hands. You know, there's cleaning it, and then there's adding hand sanitizer. You wouldn't want to do one without the other if you're being meticulous about things. So you do have to first clean your equipment and then sanitize it, specifically on anything that happens on the cold side, which is after you've boiled and cooled things down. Anything that touches that beer has to be both cleaned and sanitized. Otherwise, you're asking for an infection and spoilage in your beer. And on the hot side, anything that happens before you boil it should be clean, but it does not need to be sanitized. You don't need to sanitize your brew kettle or anything like that. So the things that you would need to get started, first and foremost, you need a boil kettle. And there's two ways to go about this if you're doing extract. You can boil the entire volume of your beer, or you could just boil a partial boil and then dilute with water. It gets a little bit harder to do that when you're talking all grain stuff, because you really want to capture all of your sugars from the mash. But when you're doing it this way, you can get away with boiling about 3 gallons and then adding 2 gallons of water. And it might mess with your bitterness, and that's something that you'll have to dial in. But it is a good way to get started if you only have, say, like a 5-gallon stock pot at home. But if you do have an 8-gallon capacity and you can boil the whole thing at once, it's a big improvement in process and in the flavor. You're going to need a burner that's capable of boiling this much stuff. Even 3 gallons on an electrical element at home is probably a bit much, and it will start to really weigh heavily on that element, push it down. And my friend Seth, that I taught how to brew at home, he destroyed an element on his rental home's range just by having that much weight on it and running it for that long. It burned up on itself. So you'll need a fermenter. So a lot of people use glass carboys. They're good. You can see within them. They're a little bit dangerous. They can get slippery, and when you drop them, they explode. I've exploded one. It was under pressure, and I knocked it off of a bar stool that I was unwisely balancing it on. And luckily, I had a T-shirt wrapped around it to keep the dark out, because it exploded and it shredded that T-shirt like Swiss cheese. So they're a little bit dangerous. James here at Groundbreaker won't use them because Denny Kahn, who's actually, we'll plug their thing I think it's next week or weekend after next. DennyCon's going to be here doing an autumn festival with them. I'm not sure what the festivities are, but Denny's a real famous home brewer, one of the original sort of ambassadors of home brewing. He does the Experimental Brewing podcast. If you've ever listened to that one, it's a really good podcast. Denny's going to be here, but Denny basically shamed James long enough that he switched to all plastic fermenters. I still use glass. I have broken several of them, and they are dangerous. But you can use food-grade buckets. Those are great. They have easy access. They do get scratched up, which can harbor bacteria, but just don't scrub them. Just soak them in cleanser.
Can I jump in with a word about burners?
Yeah.
Because we're coming up on Thanksgiving, and so turkey fryers, right? So the turkey fryers you can buy at Home Depot and stuff. That's how I got my first burner for boiling work. Was waiting till after Thanksgiving, and then they go on sale, and you can get a cheap turkey fryer. I
did mention turkey fryers on here. I just didn't say it, but they are a great way to get started. And if you watch Homebrew Finds, he's always posting. That dude's name is Chris, and he's very friendly to the club. He was actually here for the big PNW Northwest homebrew competition. He was here that day, coincidentally. If you watch Homebrew Finds, you'll find deals on burners all the time, and it's great. Oh, hey, how's it going? Help yourself to a beer?
A comment on the glass carboys.
Yeah.
Refer to glass. There are some, they're making now some pretty nice handle setups that have straps.
Oh, yeah.
So the main thing with the carboy, especially when it's wet and you're rinsing it or something, they're slick.
Especially if you've got PBW all over it.
But I thought about getting some of these handle attachments.
Yep. And people say great things about the better bottles, which are basically like a water cooler jug. They're plastic, clear plastic, that's food safe stuff. So there's good options out there for fermenters. Help yourself to a beer if you want. So I've got a porter. No, is this? Yeah, that's the porter. There's an amber lager, and then there's some commercial beers as well. So about the cleaning and the sanitation, I've sworn for a long time by both the combination of PBW, which is professional brewery wash, and Star San. I know a lot of options are out there, but you really, the key here is that you want specific dedicated cleanser and specific dedicated sanitizer. There's stuff out there called One Step. It does not both clean and sanitize. It's fine at cleaning, but you do need a no rinse sanitizer. Anything that you have to rinse off, you're just putting tap water back onto your equipment, and it's billions of microbes in there that could cause spoilage. So first a cleanser, then a sanitizer. And with the sanitizer, you can always put that into a spray bottle from Home Depot, and it lasts so much longer that way, instead of filling up 5 gallons at a time, dunking things into it, and then having to dump 5 gallons back out. I have a little spray bottle. I fill things like kegs to sanitize, but I usually rely on the spray bottle for little stuff. And I do fill fermenters because there's just so much space there, surface area. You don't want to miss anything. But so cleaning, sanitizing, different processes, and you shouldn't do one without the other. You'll need a thermometer, specifically in extract brewing, for checking the temperature before you pitch your yeast. If you pitch it anywhere above 90, you run the risk of just absolutely killing it. So you want to be making sure that you're getting down below. Pitching temperature should be a little bit below where you expect to ferment. So if you're thinking to ferment at 68, maybe pitch it at 65 and allow it to slowly rise up to where you want to be fermenting. You'll get cleaner beer that way. But not too cold, because you can shock it pretty badly and it goes straight to sleep. You'll need a hydrometer. And so a hydrometer is great because it lets you know, first of all, the potential alcohol, the sugars that are in your beer. Also, when your beer's finished fermenting, it will let you know that it's done. So you take a couple readings, 1 day, 2 days, 3 days apart, and okay, my beer's no longer fermenting. The sugars are no longer disappearing from my beer, and now it's time to package it. And then you can calculate your alcohol percentage off of that. It's one of those things that is pretty essential to home brewing. You're not going to probably have one around the house, but you should buy one. And any good homebrew kit's probably going to have everything that I just mentioned in it. And your local homebrew store will have them, and so will More Beer. I put More Beer on here just because I've had the best experience with them as an online retailer. And then packaging. So you'll need bottles with caps, or swing top bottles, that's these, or a keg setup. Most people aren't starting with a keg setup because they're probably $150 worth of stuff plus a dedicated fridge. And, you know, you probably aren't. If you're thinking about making your first ever beer, you probably don't already have that investment there. So starting with bottles is a great way to do it. You'll need probably 48 12-ounce bottles, or 24 Bonners, the 22-ounce bottles. And you can buy clean ones, or you can clean with PBW and reuse anything that doesn't have a twist cap. You want crown cap. So this is my high-tech brewing setup. I have a banjo burner with 4 cinder blocks holding it up in the driveway there. It's not the fanciest setup, but it's been working for me. Some optional equipment. You can have a wort chiller. Wort chillers are great because they are a heat exchanger that strips the heat away after you've boiled. It's a lot faster than just doing an ice bath, and a lot less chance for infection. I choose to use a water filter. I use a carbon block water filter and filter all my water. You want to get the chlorine out of it. Chlorine can cause an off flavor that's similar to Band-Aid, which nobody wants in their beer. You can also use Camden tablets, or just leave it out overnight is a way to drive off the chlorine. I choose to use a water filter because I just want to know that I'm starting from a nice clean base. And then as you move on, you're going to want to maybe invest in some fermentation temperature control. When fermentation happens, the yeast generates its own heat, and it can really take off. Yeast is happiest when it's just gorging itself and blowing up the heat, and it's sort of a battle between us wanting them to thrive and also restraining them, because those higher temperatures, they like to throw all kinds of off flavors off. And you're trying to brew a pale ale, and it tastes like a Belgian. It's got all these like bubblegum and clove type flavors and things like that you don't want going on. So you're trying to restrain the fermentation while at the same time encouraging it to proceed. So we want to try and keep it in a temperature band of like 65 to 72 for this particular beer. It's an IPA, and that's a pretty happy range for it. So you can do easy things at home. If you don't have an old fridge with a thermostat or something like that, what you can do is you can use a bucket of cool water and put a t-shirt, dip it in the water, and then have it draped over your fermenter, and it will wick away heat as it evaporates. You just create a swamp cooler. And I put a link here. There are so many different photographs here. It's an easy concept, but it makes a huge difference on your fermentation temperature. You also want to try and get the hops out of don't carry them over to the fermenter. You can use, there's mesh bags specifically for that, or you could use any sort of mesh, or you can just strain it out on the way from the kettle to the fermenter, just to try and keep them out of there and let the wort be clean. So any questions so far, like just on equipment stuff, or anybody want to add anything?
I have a question about the carbon block filter you're using there, actually. So how much did that one run you, and is that powered, or is you just turn on the hose tap and it just pumps its way through that block, or what?
Yeah, it's just an inline filter from my garden hose, and it cost me maybe $15, $20 for the case, and maybe $10 or $15 for the blocks, which you can replace. And the reason that mine's like 10 or 15 is it's some ridiculous like 1 micron filter. Like
I have one that I got for about the same price, and you basically screw it on. It's an inline for like a trailer or a motorhome or something like that.
Sure.
And but it doesn't have the ability to replace the carbon inside. So I'd like to have that ability. I don't know how dirty my stuff is inside right now, so
sure.
I'll have to look into that.
I'll put a link to the specific one that I have up on the on this blog entry.
Yeah, that'd be great.
All right. Anybody else here in the house have something to add?
Well, one thing I was going to say was that cooling obviously is a priority most of the time, but every once in a while you'll need to warm a little tiny bit.
Yeah.
And one thing that I've used that seems to be pretty helpful to bring it up a few degrees is little warming pads that you can get at the store for like warming seeds.
Yeah.
And I put those under my fermenter, and it'll just bring it up a few degrees sometimes. Or if you're trying to finish something off, right? If you feel like fermentation slowed and you want to warm it up to maybe about 70, and it's not quite that warm in your garage or whatever, you can use one of those little pads.
Yeah. Absolutely. And you can even do something as simple as, if you know one area of your home is cooler and one area is warmer, start in the cool area, and as things begin to slow, move it to the warm area. Like if downstairs is, you know it's about 60 degrees in your, bottom floor, but it's closer to 70 on the upper floor, you can always just carry it, up there as fermentation begins to slow. Because you don't want to go warm and then crash out right away, because you'll end up having an incomplete fermentation. There's a lot of byproducts left over in fermentation, and you want to keep that sort of on an even slope up so that everything gets cleaned up, because the yeast is really good at going and cleaning up after itself. It's kind of like a Windows install, where it's like, oh, you're just throwing files everywhere, and then you want to go back and do that cleanup procedure, get rid of all the install files. All righty, so talking about the recipe here. So the whole point of the recipe was to be a good first timer. There's not a lot of fancy stuff in this this beer, except for a couple of things that I'll mention. We're using sorghum, and a lot of gluten-free beer uses sorghum. The knock on sorghum wasn't always, will be that metallic twang. It's there, it's present, and if you brew with sorghum, you're going to be sort of just trying to keep it in check. You're going to be fighting against it. We're sitting in a brewery right now that uses sorghum as their primary fermentable, and they do great stuff to fight it, but it's a lot of effort. Like, they do a lot with chestnuts and lentils here. The way that we're fighting the sorghum is with grapefruit flavor. So when I was first researching sorghum and how it worked, I was thinking about what I could do, because it said, everything I was reading said it's kind of tart, it's kind of a twang, it's kind of metallic, it tastes like a bacterial infection that makes beer sour. And I was like, well, what about grapefruit? Because it kind of has that metallic twang to it. And then I looked and saw that that's exactly what Ghostfish does. They do a grapefruit IPA, and I did I soured a beer with lactobacillus and then added grapefruit flavor to it. And I brewed those two beers at the same time, and I was like, sorghum's not a problem, like if you take the right steps. And they on their blog, they had talked about using like Cascade and Centennial and I want to say like Columbus CTZ hops, but I did see that at some point they switched over and started using the hops that we use in this beer, which are called experimental grapefruit hops. And you can find those at Yakima Valley Hops. They're not a super popular hop, and they're kind of specific just to that one farm. So that it can be hard to find. I do have a link here on where to find them. They're great people, and I do recommend seeking out this hop for this beer, but you could also use something like Citra or Amarillo or a combination of the two to get that grapefruit flavor. We're going to use 6 pounds of sorghum and 3 pounds of brown rice syrup. And then for color, because if you were to just brew that beer, it would be white. You want to add a pound of what's called D45 Belgian candy sugar, and that's a beet sugar that's caramelized to an amber color. And it's going to give the beer a nice, like, 7 SRM color. And then somebody had asked about how to add body to the beer. I think it's Wesley who actually was supposed to be here but couldn't make it today due to a loss in the family, which is, I want to send prayers to him for that. So this corn maltodextrin. You can also use tapioca maltodextrin, which is what I think that it says Ghostfish uses. And maltodextrin is kind of unfermentable. It leaves behind some unfermentable dextrins that will add some body and some sweetness to the beer, so that you're not drinking just a completely dry alcohol beer, which is popular in IPAs right now. The brute IPAs are very popular, but we want to leave something behind in the glass. For bittering hops, I use Bravo hops, which I happen to have a lot of. It's a good traditional IPA hop, and I was adding 0.75 ounces and boiling that for 60 minutes, and also for 5 minutes boiling 1 ounce of experimental grapefruit hops. And then after the boil is done, so you boil it for the full 60 minutes, and then you turn the flame off and let it sit still. And then you can add 2 ounces of the grapefruit hops. And what that will do is the boiling drives off some of the more volatile flavor compounds from the hop. And if you just let it sit still and steep it, it will reduce the bitterness and preserve some of those flavor compounds and aroma compounds. And most IPAs do have, excuse me, some sort of aroma rest or whirlpool hop addition. So the kettle additions also included a kettle fining. I use Whirlflock. You can also use Irish moss. Whirlflock is it's this little tablet right here, and that's Irish moss that's been pulverized and packed into a little disc. And what that does is Irish moss is actually a seaweed, and it basically gives a bonding material for protein particles, haze particles in the beer to grab onto and drop to the bottom of the kettle. Otherwise, you might end up with some hazy beer, but Whirlflock and Irish moss are great about binding those protein particles and dropping them out. And then this is why yeast beer nutrient. There's not a lot of the things that yeast needs for healthy fermentation in fermentables, and specifically our gluten-free fermentables are missing a lot of the things that we need. So we want to add some back, and this beer nutrient is a great way to do it. And somebody, can't remember who it was, somebody did the research. Was it Ben?
Yeah. All of the Fermade products had pretty strong data saying that they're all gluten-free, so I think they're safe to use. Okay,
great. There was one that I was unsure of. White Labs makes one called Cervomyces that is basically dead yeast cells, and I assume that they're harvesting it from their own fermenters, which use barley-based extract, I believe. So I've stayed away from that one. I used to use it all the time, but I've steered away from it since going gluten-free. So you want to add that in, that yeast nutrient, to provide a healthy fermentation. And then the star of the show actually is the yeast. Without it, there would be no beer going on here. Excuse me. Safale US05 is a good dry yeast. It's the famous Chico strain, which Sierra Nevada Brewing Company is who made the Chico strain famous. It's a very clean fermenting California ale yeast. It's used pervasively in just about every craft brewery. And we want to stick to the dry yeast cultures. Liquid yeast cultures from Y Yeast, White Labs, and Imperial yeast are grown on barley malts and have barley in the package. So if we're being zero tolerance, we're staying away from barley in the package. And then after the fermentation, we're going to talk about these processes, but you want to reserve 2 ounces of experimental grapefruit to add as dry hops directly to the fermenter after fermentation. And then the zest of 1 or 2 grapefruits soaked in vodka. And if you're being strict, there's potato vodka. I typically, with distilled stuff, I don't really care for myself consumption, but since I know I'm serving this beer here probably next month, I use potato vodka because not everybody that comes here only has celiac. They might have a wheat condition or something like that. So allergies, other food allergies. So I specifically used potato vodka. And the reason that you're using the vodka is to kill any bacteria, spoilage organisms that might be on the peel of the grapefruit. You don't want that getting into your beer, causing souring, excessive souring. And it also helps extract the flavors. You know, you create a nice tincture there, and it all goes in the fermenter. So that's the recipe. Does anybody have questions before I launch into, or things to add before I launch into the brew day process?
Just a little question about the recipe. So you mentioned the metallic element that the sorghum adds. So this recipe, you could say, is really actually using that to sort of highlight those flavors. Is that?
That's the idea. Use it as a springboard. So you spend a lot of time, especially with dark beers, really trying to fight that twang, because it does kind of hint a little bit at like citrusy hop, and it plays it up really well in that way. But when you do dark beers, you're really fighting it and adding things like these guys do chestnuts in their dark ale, and they toast them to get that flavor. Otherwise, it clashes really hard with dark malts. So no, you're right. It does. It uses it as a benefit rather than a detriment. Yeah.
You commented you were for your grapefruit. You were using lacto fermentation. When do you do that, and how do you fill it off before you go?
Yeah, that was a different beer other than this one. And I did. I soured it with lactobacillus capsules, and I did it before boiling, so that way it was killed off before.
And that flavor carries oil, okay?
Yeah, it tastes like a yogurt lacto twang. Yeah, so kettle sours are pretty popular beers outside of what we do as well. A lot of kettle sours out there.
Is that classically what's done? That they'll sour it first
and then boil? And then, unless you have usually like dedicated sour equipment, a lot of people do longer term mixed fermentations, and that's kind of the long way to go about it, where you would add, excuse me, to the fermentation you would add Pediococcus, Lactobacillus, Brettanomyces, and kind of a blend, and have that.
And have them all going at once.
Have them all going at once, and it takes a year or more to finish. Yeah. So like your Flanders Reds and Browns, and I love those beers, and I still have a ton of barley sours just sitting in my house from when I quit gluten about a year and a half ago, and I'm waiting for my other brew club friends to come pick them up and take them away because they're making me sad. They're sitting in barrels around my house and fermenters in every corner of the house. All right, I'll move on to the brew day process. We kind of more or less talked about all of this. So first things first, get your, source your water. If you're doing a full boil batch, you want about 7 gallons. The thing that I always forget whenever I'm doing extract is that the extract that I'm adding has volume as well. And I forget that every time. I'll fill up 7.5 gallons of water, and then I'll start adding my extract, and I'm like, I just added another half gallon of volume into this kettle. So start with 7 gallons. You're going to boil quite a bit off and get down closer to like 6. I did this to myself again, where I added too much volume to the kettle on this particular day. So you'll see some of my numbers are off. If you're doing a partial batch or boil batch, so say you only have a 5-gallon kettle at home, you'll want to boil, you'll want to cobble together the full extract amount and enough water to get to about 3 gallons without boiling over. Boilovers are messy. They will trash your stove. Some of that's, the sugars can be flammable or at least caramelize all over your stove. So you want to try to avoid boilovers. Plus you can also put your flame out, which I've done. So as the water's nearing a boil, I added 6. So you can add all the sorghum and all the brown rice syrup and the candy sugar and the maltodextrin and mix them well. You'll see here my picture here. My daughter took this picture. I look absolutely pained while I'm adding this stuff. I'm seriously in deep concentration. But what I'm doing is I'm deflecting so that I don't pour it straight onto the bottom of the kettle and scorch. I was just kind of trying to deflect it there. You want to try and keep the fermentables off the bottom of the kettle so that you don't scorch it. It tastes bad and it can change the color and flavor of your beer. A funny story is I knew a guy that brewed with barley malt extract, and he once was making a stout or a porter. It was a porter, and he dropped it straight down onto the bottom of the kettle, scorched the heck out of his kettle, tasted the beer, said it tasted like smoke, entered it as a smoke beer, as a smoked porter into a competition, and took a blue ribbon, even though there was no smoked malts in his beer. So it will affect the flavor if you do scorch your fermentables on the bottom of the kettle. So add all those ingredients. Some people do this. Some people reserve some or most of the sorghum until near the end of the boil and add it and mix it in because it might create less twang. I'm not sure of that process. I tried it in this when I did it, but just for simplicity, if you want to add all your fermentables, go right ahead as it's approaching boil. Talking about the scorching. Then begin a timer. You're going to be boiling this beer for 60 minutes. This is a picture of my hop strainer. It's basically a column, a stainless steel mesh column that I add my hops into, and they get exposure here in the boil, but they stay contained within there. When I pull them out, it's less mess. Same concept as using something like a bag. Kettle spider is another way to go. So you're boiling for 60 minutes. The Bravo hops will stay in for the full hour. These are your bittering hops. At about 15 minutes, you should add your yeast nutrient in your Whirlflock tablet. And if you're using an immersion chiller, it should go in at that point too, so that way you're boiling off any bad stuff from the chiller. And then when you get to 5 minutes, you'll want to add your experimental grapefruit hops, 1 ounce of, and those are the flavor hops. And then you boil for that last 5 minutes, turn the flame off, and then while things are sitting still, add your 2 ounces of experimental grapefruit hops and let those steep. That's your aroma rest and that's your aroma hops. And it's really going to make your IPA pop. Then it becomes time to chill the wort. You want to try to get from wherever your aroma rest ended, which is probably going to be about 200 degrees. You want to get from there to 65 or so degrees as quickly as possible. How you get there is up to you. So I use an immersion chiller. This is just a copper coil going into my kettle. Cold water comes in through this line right here. That's my garden hose. And it comes out over here through another tube and just spills into my driveway, which my wife hates, thinks it's wasteful. But we live in Oregon, so if I put it in the yard, it's just going to further flood our yard. So I don't really have a solution there. You can recapture that water. In the summertime, I do try to hook it up to a sprinkler, and then the kids try to jump through it, and it's like 180 degrees, and I have to tell them not to. But so that's the idea here is that the cool water is going to strip away the heat. Oh, hey, Tim.
Hey.
Hey, you been here long?
Sorry, I'm a little late.
That's okay. We just finished talking about the boil. This whole thing's going to be up on YouTube, and we also have the blog post. I'm basically just stepping through the blog post that I just put up on the website last night. And I know that you've done this a few times because you've put up pictures of your beers recently, the sorghum beers you're doing. So anyway, yeah, the heat exchange, that's just a copper chiller that's pulling away the heat. You could also take the entirety of your kettle and put it into an ice bath, and with a sanitized spoon, give it a swirl, get a good whirlpool going, and just continue to add ice to that ice bath and watch the temperature drop. If you're doing a partial boil, this is something I used to do when I was a barley extract brewer back in the day, and I only had a 5-gallon kettle. I would boil my 3 or so gallons, and then I would, the night before, take 2 gallons of water, freeze them, and then just basically cut off the plastic, dump them straight into the fermenter, into the hot wort, and it would almost always balance out to like 60 degrees or so. Adding 2-gallon ice blocks would always drop it down to about the right temperature.
Yeah. Set your fermenter into the sink and then just run some water and ice. You don't have.
Yeah. Yeah. So Ray was saying that a big utility sink is a great way to do that ice bath.
Those big plastic buckets you get for like when you have a barbecue.
Yeah, like a toy bucket.
It usually fits in there pretty well. You can always ice down.
Yeah, any large, receptacle that you can do an ice bath in. So once you're down to about your fermentation temperature, so between like 65, 70 degrees, what you're going to want to do is begin to transfer the wort. I have a ported kettle, so I have a little tube that comes out the bottom of my kettle, and I just run it out slowly into my fermenter, and I try I'll run it down the side of the inside of the fermenter so that it fans out and picks up oxygen on the way, or you can splash it real hard. If you are dumping into a funnel or into a bucket, give it some good action there, because we want to try and get some oxygen into the wort. We pretty much boiled off all the oxygen in that liquid for an hour, and the yeast needs oxygen. So we'll be splashy about getting it into the fermenter, and then trying to leave the hops behind, and also there'll be some proteins in the kettle that you dropped out with your Whirlfloc. That's called Trub, another German word, T-R-U-B. You want to leave that Trub behind if you can, and just try and get as clean into the kettle into the fermenter as you can. Clean wort in, clean wort out, clean beer out. So we're going to oxygenate it. You can shake the thing for 20, 30 minutes, which is a good workout. I have an aversion to that. So I have a diffuser stone that I hook up to an oxygen tank, and I just inject oxygen into the thing for, a minute, and then it's fully oxygenated. You could do this similar thing with an aquarium pump. Those are real cheap at the pet store, and you can just run a line out with a diffusion stone. But once again, everything has been sanitized that's touching the beer after we chilled it.
Using an aquarium pump, you might want to pick up the filter.
Right.
Because you don't want to be pumping microbes out of the air.
Right. There's little inline, what's that word? What's that acronym for the type of filter that it is? HEPA filter, yeah. There you go. There's little inline HEPA filters that are as cheap as free that you can add to that, and it will keep out the gunk. So you should you should have a hydrometer, and you should take a reading, and you should take a look here. You're reading below the meniscus. See that little rise right there where it looks like it's 60? If you drop down another, I always estimate add 2 points. So it's probably about a 1062 wort, because it does rise up the shaft of the hydrometer. And this tells me the potential sugars, or the sugars that are in there, and that's the potential alcohol. 1062 is a pretty mid-range. I was shooting for 1068, but once I said I put too much water because I wasn't paying attention to the volume that I was adding with the fermentables. So 1062 is fine, because I ended up with a whole bunch of leftover wort. And you can use an ABV calculator. In fact, I'll do that right now since we're all right here. This is Brewer's Friend. So we started at 1062. My goal is to get down to at least 1012. It might go down below that. And if you calculate that, it says your beer should be a 6.56% ABV beer, which is center of style for an IPA. All right, so take that gravity reading so you know what you're starting from. This is a sample that I pulled, and it does not go back into the fermenter, because even if it's sanitized, you really don't want to take beer out and then add it back in. You're risking infection. And then pitching the yeast. So you've got your appropriate temperature achieved. You've oxygenated the wort. Now it's time to inoculate it with some Saccharomyces. You can just take the packets and sprinkle them directly onto the top. that's an okay thing to do. If you do that, you might want to use 2 packets because there's some attrition that happens with that process. This is one of those never-ending arguments, but there's a good chance that you're killing off some yeast cells if you choose to do it that way. If you choose to rehydrate it first with water, just boil 10 times the weight of the yeast packet, cool it, and then add the yeast. Do not boil the yeast. I've seen so many beginning brewers go 10 times the yeast weight, and then they add it, and then they boil it, and then they've killed their yeast, and it won't make beer anymore. So boil and cool some water, add it to it. What I do sometimes if I'm doing it this way is I'll boil the water, cool it down, add the yeast, and then I'll go about all of my transferring of the wort, oxygenation, all of that stuff. When I come back, the yeast is foamy and it's proofed and it's ready to go. And I add it to my fermenter. After a day or two, it goes crazy. It starts to look like what I call a zymergical lava lamp. It just goes nuts, swirling around. It's hypnotizing to stare at. I'm trying to pull it up here, but we're struggling with the. There it goes. Ooh. And the airlock starts bubbling like crazy, and it smells wonderful. Priceless hacks for parents. So after about a week or so, you'll notice that the airlock begins to slow. You take another sample. It looks like it's finished. You've got an idea of where it should finish if you look at a recipe calculator. It should finish around 1012, 1010. If you see that it's starting 1.010 or 1.012, you see that it's beginning to finish, and it's time to add your dry hops. You add them straight to the fermenter. You can also use bags. Some people use bags and mesh bags and add it to the fermenter and drop it to the bottom. And you want those to sit for about 5 days to give a good fresh dry hop flavor. And then that's probably a good time to add the grapefruit zest as well. So what I talked about is just zest this grapefruit. That's my zester. It's a microplane. You can just use a vegetable peeler. You want to get the zest and not the pith. You don't want the white stuff. It's a little bit bitter and tannic. And then that's just a little mason jar. I added some vodka to it to about cover it. And that hopefully killed off all the baddies. And then it did a good job of extracting that grapefruit flavor. And I'll add probably the dry hops and the zest around the same time. Let them sit there for about 5 days. They'll impart their flavor to the beer. And then it becomes time to package. Anybody have questions or things to add about the brew day and fermentation processes?
So anything other than vodka that you use, or is that required? I'm just thinking I've done other stuff instead of using vodka, especially with grapefruit orange, using to make the limoncello was
as long as it's a high enough proof that you think it's going to kill off this stuff, you're probably okay. And if it's a flavor that you want in your beer, it might migrate.
I know it's high enough proof, not everything.
Yeah, Everclear would be awesome for that. Although it is, it's a wheat based, right? Everclear is made out of, or what's it made out of?
It can be made without,
yeah. So yeah, whatever kind of stuff you have. I drink bourbon and things like that because I firmly believe that the distillation process, you're not carrying those proteins out to the finished product. I know a lot of people don't, so I just playing it safe there. But yeah, Everclear would be great because that's
Joe. Hey Joe, I got something to add.
Oh, hey Bob.
What's up? Hey, so sometimes I'm not dry hopping for 5 days. I sometimes will go 3 or 2 days. It really depends. And then a lot of times what I'm also doing is I'm sometimes racking to a different vessel after the dry hop because otherwise, you can sometimes bring a lot of the hop material into the package.
Oh, you're breaking up.
So I guess it really depends on what your ability is. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right. I guess it depends on how cold you can get it at home. I have a separate fridge for beer, so I'm a little spoiled, but at the same time, it does really help a lot of the hops fall out of suspension as well. And kind of the resulting beer is a little bit clearer. I mean, when you're dry hopping, you are still going to get a fair amount of polyphenols in the suspension.
Yeah.
So it is hard to have that like West Coast clear IPA kind of a thing going on, but at the same time, it still does help, and definitely would be my recommendation, because a lot of times, especially since you're packaging a lot of times with yeast, if you're bottle conditioning, when the yeast chews on that hop for a long time, it can kind of give off an undesirable either smell or taste. So that's just something to throw in there. I mean, I guess it really depends on how much you're dry hopping with as well. Because like I've done like 3 to 5 ounces in the dry hop, and I'll tell you, yeah, you probably want to give it another second to let a lot of those hops fall out of suspension, unless you're like down to drink salad beer.
Yeah, I think everybody knows. Well, everybody that knows me knows that I layer dry hops. Like I'll dry hop 2 ounces and then wait a few days, 2 ounces, then wait a few days, another ounce, wait a few days. And then I do cold crash. And I didn't get into cold crashing because, this was just supposed to be like the early brewer, first timer type of thing. And yeah, if you have the ability to chill the beer before you package it, take that opportunity, because it will help a lot with the clarity of the beer. For sure. Good point.
Hey, Joe, a couple of questions on materials. So Joe, you mentioned about sorghum syrup as one possible base. Could you speak a little bit about some of the other options for base syrups besides sorghum, if it's got that taste you have to fight against? I'm assuming there's some positives why you'd want to use sorghum, but maybe there's other options, or I don't know, more expensive, or just maybe not, so it doesn't have that issue.
So it is the most widely available. You could do more of the rice, and that's why I have like a 2-to-1 ratio of the sorghum to the rice, is to kind of cut into that instead of going 9 pounds of sorghum. I'm cutting it with some of the brown rice syrup, because it does help minimize that flavor, or cut into it a little bit. Like Dan from Moon Shrimp doesn't like the way sorghum tastes, so he doesn't use it at all. He uses Belgian candy sugar. He makes his own candy sugar, and that's a dangerous process. But his beers also end up being extremely dry and thin. It doesn't leave anything behind in the kettle. As far as syrups go, those are really the two that are widely distributed, the brown rice syrup and the sorghum. Anybody else know of other extract type? That's really the two at this point.
You're only going to get some millet if you're going all grain, I guess, then, right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And it'd be super cool if people started making millet DME, or LME.
Yeah.
Not out there though.
You can use like organic or raw sugars or other things like that as well if you don't have it. I mean, like
and they'll be a little dry, those beers, because they're fully fermentable.
A lot of times that can help combat some of the taste of the sorghum.
So hey Joe, last question, or one more question. You were talking about some of the dry yeasts. And could you speak about Nottingham? Is that one cultured on gluten-containing substrates, or no? Do you know?
Ben's shaking his head. I'm not sure about the Danstar yeasts.
All of the Danstar dry yeasts, from what I understand, are safe to use. And,
okay, great.
Yeah.
So that was a positive head shake.
I'm sorry. So I'm pretty sure I'm not 100% sure, but I think there's a package that I had at one point that said gluten-free actually written on the Danstar Nottingham package.
Okay, great. I have not used those since early on in my barley days, but that's good to know. Do they sell them on glutenfreehomebrew.org, the Danstar yeasts? That would be a good way to know.
Yeah.
I know they carry all the Mangrove Jacks, and they carry the Fermentus line.
Mm-hmm.
Safil.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, we can research that and put the answer up. Cool. All right, anything else before I move on to the packaging?
Brian does sell the Danstar yeast.
Okay, so yeah, the question was, how long did I let the zest sit on the vodka? And it's fine to go, 2-3 days. You can go longer, it doesn't matter, but a minimum of 2-3 days. Okay, and then that was an affirmative that Danstar yeasts must be gluten-free, homebrew.org.
Yep.
Great. So packaging, unless you just want to take a straw and drink it out of the carboy, you got to get the beer into another vessel for serving. Most people who are starting off, that means bottles. Bottle conditioning is awesome. Sierra Nevada Pale Ale is still bottle conditioned to this day, and it's one of the best beers in history. So hopefully somebody got to drink that before they had to switch off gluten. Anyway, the point is that bottle conditioning is not just for newbies. A lot of very reputable people still do it. And what the process is there is that you're going to add some sugar to your finished beer. There will still be enough yeast in suspension to ferment that sugar. You're going to add that sugar, and there's a priming calculator that I've linked here on the page. You'll add that sugar to the finished beer and then transfer the beer into sanitized bottles and then cap them. And basically you're just having a second fermentation in the bottle. There's no airlock this time to let the CO2 out. So because of that, the CO2 has no place to go but into solution in the beer. And that's pretty ingenious, and you get really nice carbonation that way. It takes about 2-3 weeks for that fermentation in the bottle to take place and finish. And then you'll want to chill it down and drink it and enjoy it. If you're lucky enough to have a kegging system, you would only have to worry about cleaning one fermentation or one packaging vessel. That's just one big keg. You rack your beer straight onto the keg and then seal it, and you can either inject CO2, that's forced carbonation, or you can add sugar to the keg, seal it, and let it sit warm for 2-3 weeks, and that's like cask fermentation or cask conditioning. There is a fine layer of yeast that gets left behind in the bottle if you're doing the bottle conditioning, and it will collect at the bottom, and just when you pour your beer, leave that behind. It can taste a little, there's a flavor attribute called yeast bite, and sometimes you'll see people get a fancy beer and they'll pour it and they'll swirl it all around and dump the yeast in, and it's like, why did you do that? It's not supposed to go into there, except for certain things like Hefeweizens and stuff like that. You might want to get that yeast in there, but I don't. It causes intestinal distress and it smells bad. I don't want it in my beer. All right, so that was just the end on packaging. Just it's got to sit at room temperature for a couple of weeks, and then you can chill it down. If you add your sugar and then put it straight in the fridge, it may never carbonate, or it may take months to carbonate if you do it that way. All right, anything else? Oh, and then there's a bunch of resources that I haven't made links to, just some great places to start. I'm going to link this groundbreaker homebrew recipe because it's a good one for starting. It uses, it's a little bit more advanced than this one that I did. You toast some lentils and some buckwheat, and you steep that, and it creates a little bit of a more malty flavor. It's a pretty good recipe, and I've done it a bunch of times, and I've changed up some of the color with different beet sugars to create some different beers and altered the roasting time on their lentils and the buckwheat, and it's a fun one to play with. So I'll link that one as well, and it's also in the files section of the Facebook page. Cool. That went faster than I thought it was going to go.
Is there a difference between letting it sit for the 2 to 3 weeks at temperature, standing upright compared to on its side?
They say you probably want to do it standing upright because that yeast is going to collect, and if you do it that way, it might collect on the side of the bottle. Also, you might get oxidation with the crown cap, but that would probably take a year or so to get that kind of oxidation that I know for long-term storage you want them standing up. But yeah, I guess the big reason there would just be that you'd get the yeast cake across the side of the bottle. It's going to go in your beer. Any other stuff, guys?
If there is any, just in case there is any, first timers listening to this or whatever, one thing for accuracy's sake on the hydrometer, make sure you know what temperature your hydrometer is calibrated to. And Brewer's friend Joe just showed us the ABV calculator. There's also a temperature hydrometer temperature adjustment calculator as well. Yeah. Takes 2 seconds to type it in. I mean, if you're only a couple degrees off, it's not usually a big deal, but if you're around 10 degrees off, it can be a whole, gravity point in difference. So just make sure you're aware of that.
Absolutely. Yep. That's the hydrometer adjustment calculator right there. Mm-hmm. Cool. So who's going to go brew next weekend? Yeah. Awesome.
I had a question about you do the hops in the strainer.
Yeah.
And the way we usually do it is just let them in there because they're moving around a lot in there.
Right. Yeah.
That's what you want. It seems like you get enough in the little
strainer. Yeah, I think I get enough contact time because things are boiling and they're moving around and yeah, I understand definitely what I used to do is I used to have a little mesh pouch that I put around the dip tube at the bottom of my kettle, and that would kind of strain things out. But it would get clogged sometimes with Troop, and at a certain point, after taking it off, cleaning it, it started to fall apart. I said, I need a better solution here. So I started doing the hop spider, but I think it gets enough contact time. I haven't noticed that my beers are ever bitter or the flavor's not getting in there.
So when you use like 5-6 inches across, it goes the whole.
Yeah, it's a deep column, but it's wide. Yeah.
That's a big difference. I was thinking the shallow.
No, it's fully. It goes down to the bottom of my kettle, and it's made for an 11 or 14 gallon kettle, but I can't brew that much beer anymore because it costs a fortune to brew 5 gallons at a time. So I don't do that anymore. But that's why I had originally bought that giant one. There's smaller ones, but they still do go down deep in the kettle. Yeah.
So your ale here that you brought, this is extract or this is grain?
No, they're all grain.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Again, there's no noticeable twang. That is, are you using lemon in this also?
No, that's a amber lager. That's a different beer than this. So that's millet, rice, and a little bit of buckwheat that I brewed. It's supposed to be an Oktoberfest. I don't know how it's tasting now that it's been sitting out.
But it's given that it has been sitting out and it's still tasting,
Nice.
then that's a good sign.
Yeah, those were all grain beers. I wanted to have this beer ready, but I didn't get to brew it the weekend that I wanted to. There were too many Little League games that weekend, and they ran late. I didn't get to do my brew day 2 weeks ago, and I just brewed this past week, so it's still chugging along. I haven't even dry hopped it yet.
Are there any drawbacks to letting the true into the fermenter? I generally do a secondary fermentation anyway, where I just take off, leave that behind.
Yeah.
Primary. But is there any drawbacks to doing it that way?
I've heard pros and cons here as well. Some people say that it's good because when you bring that stuff over, it does create things for haze particles to grab onto and drop down, and you might end up with clearer beer. I've heard people say that Troop tastes bad in the beer. It might impart some flavors to it that you don't want. I honestly don't care all that much. I don't want to bring hop matter over because that will get vegetal and tastes like stewed veggies in there, and that's no good. Boiled hops don't taste that great after the fact.
Yeah, I let my hops circulate, and then I just put it through a pretty fine mesh strainer.
Yeah.
That go into the fermenter. Now, I find that aerates the beer pretty well.
Yeah.
And takes out 95-98% of the
there's people who are super sticklers about leaving everything behind in the kettle, and there are people who are not. And I honestly believe that if Brewlosophy, if they haven't already, if they did a side-by-side, nobody would know the difference between that. But just as best practices go, I choose to leave what I can behind because I just want clean work going into the fermenter to have clean beer coming out. But that might not even be the case. It might just be my racking ability in the fermenter.
So if you're going to dry hop, and you're going to do it in a mesh bag, then that mesh bag needs to be
pre-sanitized. Yeah, boil the bag is a good way to do it.
Is that what you usually do? Boil it?
I don't use a mesh bag in dry hopping.
Oh, okay.
I free ball. I just drop them straight in and let them settle out. And then I cold crash. I get the beer down to like 32 degrees. I will use a secondary if I plan on reusing that yeast. But with dry yeast, I typically don't. So I'll just dry hop on top of the yeast, and then all that becomes garbage.
Okay.
After cold crashing, when you lower the temperature in your fermenter to like close to freezing or below 40, everything starts to fall to the bottom of the kettle or to the bottom of the fermenter and get pretty compact down there, and you'll get really clear beer.
What do you use to chill it that long?
I have a refrigerator. So my home setup for fermentation temperature control is one of the first things I invested in. So I got a Craigslist fridge. It was disgusting, but I got it, and I brought it home, cleaned it up, ripped out all the shelves, and turned it into a fermentation chamber. And I have temperature controller on my fridge and a heat wrap like you described. It's actually for reptile like terrariums, and I wrap it around my fermenters and have a stainless steel thermal well that goes into the beer itself to get a reading from inside. And the temperature probe goes down into there. And basically, I turn the fridge on and I keep it at whatever the fridge prefers, which is usually cold, pretty cold. And I wrap up the fermenter and I tell the temperature controller, heat it up to 65 or whatever, if it's a lager, 50. And it will bracket it. So if it starts to heat up too far, the heater will cut off and the fridge will chill it down. And if it starts to drop, then the temperature controller will tell the firmer to warm it up too. So I can bracket it between like 1 and 2 degrees of my desired temperature. And then I can move it up, move it down, however I want. But that was the very first thing that I did after switching to all grain barley brewing. So I don't have a ton of money for brewing, so I make my equipment purchases basically like birthday and Christmas. And just add one thing. And that's how I've progressed with my stuff. And like 8 years into it now, I've got most of what I need. 10 more birthdays.
Christmas till like 2021.
I was going to say, basically I need 10 more birthdays before I can do electric brewing. Cool. Anything else, anybody?
Does anybody fool around with fermentability of maple syrup, like as a sort of an adjunct, maybe raise ABV or something?
Any of you guys done maple syrup in your beers?
Oh.
How about the Canadians, Peter?
No, I have not. Some people told me it'll give a real bad alcohol-y type taste to it if you use the maple syrup, so I've never tried it yet, but people have been asking me to do a honey maple beer.
Yeah, people definitely use molasses in darker beers, in stouts and porters. There's a real famous one here in town, McMenamins uses, I think, blackstrap molasses in that Terminator beer.
Does it leave behind a lot of unfermented?
I don't know. I've never used it in anything, but molasses is definitely a popular one. to use in those dark beers.
So going back to, this being extract, which is where a lot of home brewers will first dip their toe, and obviously being gluten-free, which is, on the other end of the spectrum for a lot of home brewers, going back and walking back through this gluten-free 101 brewing process, what are some things that you saw or did, now having all this experience, that you really wish you would have known when you first started?
Huh. When I first started brewing, so I had to learn twice now. I made the transition first from, as a barley brewer, I used barley extracts and went to all grain. And then whenever I went gluten-free, I had to go from gluten-free extracts to all grain. I think that the key things, both times, are definitely sanitation, fermentation temperature control, and the health of the yeast pitch are really the three big things that make the biggest difference in your finished beer. As long as everything's been done clean and you don't have any infection, and as long as your fermentation has been managed well, you should end up with good beer regardless of the ingredients that you're choosing.
If I could add something to that, I would say the thing I learned the hard way is
yeast nutrients.
Switching from barley, primarily an extract barley grower years ago, and never had to put yeast nutrient into it because there was enough B vitamins or whatever in there. But with the gluten-free stuff, it doesn't have that same level of nutrition for the yeast. So
it really
need to use it.
Yeah, I think that whatever it says on the yeast nutrient label, I think it says to use like a quarter teaspoon or something like that. A full teaspoon might not be enough. It's that starved for mineral content.
Well, and those directions are for barley beer.
Right, they are for barley beer.
They don't need as much as we do.
No, we need a lot more. Good point.
So kind of down that same strand then, not to throw every yeast pitch calculator out the window then for gluten-free brewing, but would it just be safer to kind of follow the directions and then over pitch a bit as opposed to trying to use a calculator that may be more for obviously all barley brewing at that point?
I think the amount of yeast, I haven't had a problem with having to over pitch, but definitely the nutrient, like Chad said, is a good idea, but it certainly doesn't hurt to pitch a little more. But I found that the sugars are simple enough that the yeast should be able to work through them. It's just a matter of just not having that nutrient there.
Cool, thank you.
You bet. Have you brewed before in the gluten world on the other side?
Yeah, so I'm currently on the other side. Like I said, I'm on my wife's account. She's the one that bought me a starter kit, so to speak, the 2 buckets and the auto siphon and all that on the gluten side to say, hey, honey, you're going to learn all of this and figure out how this works so you can brew me gluten-free beer. So actually, she's laying on the floor with our 3 dogs right now, not to put her on the spot, pitching me questions to ask to make sure I figure these things out so I can get to gluten-free faster.
Awesome. Good. Cool. Yeah, so, I would say that start off with the sorghum stuff, see how it goes for you. Have you brewed all grain before on the barley side?
Not yet. That was my next step.
Okay.
Or add of where I was going to. Don't necessarily have, a whole ton of equipment, but I've got to say, there's a guy on YouTube who's doing all grain in his condo in like small batches, and it blew my mind. So that may be where I go next just to see how it works. But even just after today, just with this recipe, I feel even more confident to try that and dip my toe into the gluten-free world before trying to figure out all grain on the non-gluten or all gluten containing.
Yeah, so jumping from extract to all grain is difficult on the barley side, and it is extremely difficult on the gluten-free side because a lot of the mashing techniques are just far different. We have a real hard time converting those grains to fermentables because of it. I think it was at the last meeting where we talked about that, the mashing meeting. If you want to look at that video that we did, it's significant step up in level of difficulty, even for all grain brewers coming from the other side, which is what I was. It's taken me a long time, and it's still not.
Maybe doing a partial would be a good go-between.
Yeah.
Great point. Yeah, and definitely don't feel shy about steeping gluten-free grains in these sorghum beers to get some malt quality out of them. I kind of progressed that way, when I switched over to gluten-free. The first couple I did were just sorghum brown rice beers, and then I started steeping some of the grains from Grouse and Eckert that I got from glutenfreehomebrew.org. I started steeping some of the millets and rices to get some crystal flavors in there, and just like you might on the barley side already, you might be steeping some grains there and then adding DME and stuff like that, right? So you can definitely do that on the gluten-free side, getting some millet and some rice that are character malts and steeping those, and it will improve your flavor really greatly.
Awesome.
You said there's a recipe then with that's a groundbreaking recipe.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah. Those are just bulk health food ingredients. There's, I think, buckwheat groats and red lentils that you toast, and you can steep those, and it's pretty good. It's a good beer. I've enjoyed it. Great. You guys all want to hang out and drink some beers?
Back to the baby for me. I'm sure I've got diapers to change now.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I've got dinner to go make here in Central Time.
All righty. Well, I'll go ahead and end now, and we'll say goodbye.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks again for another meeting, Joe. I was glad I was able to make it this week.
That's enough battery life.
Yeah. All right. See you guys. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thank you.
Good night.
All right.
Yo, stop.